Okay, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming as well. So for those who don't know me, I work on basic philosophical questions about the structure of consciousness. I'm interested in how various kinds of structural concepts like degrees, dimensions, parts, wholes, continuity, discreteness, how those concepts can be applied to conscious experiences. And what I'm going to present today is some work at the heart of a lot of my current research on the structure of consciousness. And I want to start off with a metaphor that will be familiar to everybody in this room. It's a metaphor about phenomenal consciousness. And according to the metaphor, to be conscious is for the lights to be on inside. So you hear this metaphor a lot in philosophical and scientific discussions about consciousness, and even in ordinary discourse. And the interpretation is that the lights are on inside just in case there's something it's like to be an entity. A zombie is a creature where everything is dark inside. Now, I think this is a good metaphor. Sometimes people poke fun at metaphors like this, but I think this metaphor stands up to philosophical scrutiny. And in the paper I'll link to at the end of the talk, I argue that this metaphor is a theory neutral concept that allows us to think about consciousness more clearly. But one thing I've realized is that this metaphor is actually ambiguous. There are two different ways of interpreting this metaphor. And I think this distinction matters for consciousness research. So to see this distinction, suppose we ask, well, what exactly is consciousness within this metaphor? And I think there's two different ways of answering this question that correspond to two different concepts of phenomenal consciousness. And to see this ambiguity, we can ask, is consciousness the inner light itself, or is consciousness the illuminated room? So the goal of this talk is going to be to unpack this distinction using this metaphor, to use the metaphor to expose an ambiguity in the meaning of the term phenomenal consciousness, and to argue that this ambiguity is really important for contemporary consciousness research. And I want to argue in particular that even after we accept that what it is for an entity to be conscious is for there to be something it's like to be that entity, there's still this further ambiguity that corresponds to this distinction that I've expressed here. And I think this ambiguity is actually systemic. It permeates, I think, across all of consciousness research, and I think it cuts at the heart of several contemporary debates. So let me start by saying more about this ambiguity. If we think of consciousness as the inner light itself, then we can define consciousness as what makes an entity feel some way at all. Whereas if we think of consciousness as the illuminated room, then we could define consciousness as the way it feels to be an entity. So I'm going to call the first thing subjectivity. Subjectivity is what makes an entity feel some way at all. And I'm going to call the second thing phenomenal character. Phenomenal character is the way it feels to be an entity. And I'm going to say a lot more in the following moments to explain this distinction more precisely. But let me start by saying, I think these are both perfectly fine ways of thinking about the term phenomenal consciousness. So in my view, neither of these interpretations is correct and neither is privileged. There's a few people I've met who have said to me, who have been kind of skeptical of this distinction, who have said to me, well, it's obvious which of these is the right interpretation of phenomenal consciousness. But the problem is that different people have had different views on which interpretation is supposed to be obviously correct. So I think that's evidence that both are okay. So there's three things that I want to do in this talk. There's three central claims I want to argue for. First, I want to make a claim about ambiguity. The term consciousness can mean either subjectivity or phenomenal character. We can ask, is consciousness the light or is it the room? Second, I want to argue that there are open questions about the structure of subjectivity. These metaphorically can be thought of as questions about what are the parameters of the light? And third, I'll talk about some applications of this distinction. I'm not going to talk about too many applications, but I think in short, this distinction elucidates some open questions about degrees of consciousness, dimensions of consciousness, global states of consciousness, maybe even empty consciousness or minimal consciousness. Okay, so let me start by saying a bit more about the basic distinction itself. Now, one reason the distinction is kind of subtle is because both subjectivity and phenomenal character are compatible with the standard definition of phenomenal consciousness. An entity is conscious just in case there's something it's like to be an entity. But if there's something it's like to be an entity, then that entity must have the property that makes it feel some way at all. So it must have subjectivity. And if there's something it's like to be an entity, then that entity must feel some way. There must be some way it feels to be that entity. So that entity must have phenomenal character. So this means that the standard definition of phenomenal consciousness in terms of what it's like, it underspecifies whether we're talking about subjectivity or about phenomenal character. And in fact, one reason the distinction is fairly subtle is because subjectivity and phenomenal character, these are extensionally equivalent, meaning that necessarily something has subjectivity if and only if it has phenomenal character. And if you think of in terms of the metaphor, the lights are on if and only if the room is illuminated. But that doesn't mean that the properties are the same. And that's because the properties are structurally distinct. There can be differences in phenomenal character without differences in subjectivity, just as there can be differences in the settings of the room, even if we hold fixed the parameters of the light. So I'll say more about that in a moment. Now, so far, I've been characterizing this distinction quite abstractly and metaphorically, but I think one of the best ways of getting a grasp on the distinction is to just consider some theories of consciousness and to see how the distinction falls out of the structures of those theories. So here's the first example. Let's think about global workspace theory. According to global workspace theory, for an entity to be conscious is for it to have a global workspace. But suppose that global workspace theory is correct. We could still ask, what exactly is consciousness according to the theory? And there's two reasonable answers here. On the one hand, we could think of consciousness as the global workspace itself. And I mean, that's a reasonable answer because having a global workspace, that's what draws the line between conscious entities and non-conscious entities. But on the other hand, we could also think of consciousness within global workspace theory as not just the global workspace itself, but also the representations inside the global workspace. And that's also a reasonable answer, since if we want to know what it's like to be an entity, then we have to know not just that it has a global workspace, but also which representations are in that global workspace. So for global workspace theory, this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character falls out naturally. The global workspace is analogous to the light, and the representations inside the global workspace, plus the global workspace itself, is analogous to the illuminated room. But there's nothing special here about global workspace theory. That's just an instance of a more general pattern. And that's because the distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character, it arises across basically every theory of consciousness. So, for example, here are some prominent theories of consciousness across both the philosophy and the science of consciousness. And here's what those theories naturally identify subjectivity with, and what those theories naturally identify phenomenal character with. Now, notice that on the right-hand side, there's a plus next to each statement of phenomenal character. And that's because phenomenal character includes subjectivity. In fact, subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character. I'll say more about what that means in a moment. Notice also that this table illustrates how the distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character, it's pretty theory neutral. No matter what theory of consciousness you favor, you can make sense of this distinction. And another way to see that is to think about this even more abstractly, to think about it more schematically. Any theory of consciousness is going to have to fill in the following blanks. First, for an entity to feel some way at all, just is for it to be blank. And second, what it's like to be an entity just is a matter of blank. And what the theory says in answer to the first blank is going to tell us what that theory says about subjectivity. And what the theory says about the second blank is going to tell us what that theory says about phenomenal character. Now, obviously, the answers to these two questions are going to be systematically related to each other on just about every theory of consciousness. But also, the answers are going to differ across most theories of consciousness. For example, the answer to the first blank might be to have a global workspace, and the answer to the second blank might be the representations in the global workspace. Okay, so that's all I'll say to initially characterize this distinction. Let me turn to some questions about the structure of subjectivity, because I think that's one of the things that makes this distinction especially important. What I want to say is that there are open questions about the structure of subjectivity given the way that I've defined it. And within the context of the metaphor, we can think of these as questions about what are the parameters of the light. So I'll start by saying a little bit about how to understand the structural relationship between subjectivity and phenomenal character, and then I'll talk about the structure of subjectivity itself. So one thing I said a moment ago is that subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character. Now, a dimension in general is roughly a way of varying with respect to some kind. So to say that subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character is to say that subjectivity is one way of varying with respect to phenomenal character. Think about how the light is a dimension of the room. One way in which you can differ, one way in which two illuminated rooms can differ is by differing in their lighting settings. So you can think of this as analogous to other cases where one property is a dimension of another property. For example, think about how hue is a dimension of color, or extroversion is a dimension of personality, or speed is a dimension of velocity. Similarly, subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character. And within the metaphor, one way to think about this is just how two rooms can vary by varying with respect to their lighting conditions. Now, I'll mention that this is a rough analysis of dimension. I also have a more precise analysis of a dimension. In some other work, I'm developing an account of the structure of dimensions and what we mean when we use the term dimension. And that's ultimately in the service of clarifying what we mean by dimensions of consciousness. I'm not going to talk about this here because I think that would take us too far astray, but I put here my basic analysis of what it is for one property to be a dimension of another, and I'll just move forward from here. This point, though, is really important. Understanding the structural relationship between subjectivity and phenomenal character, I think, is really key to understanding the relationship between these two notions. Because I'm not saying that subjectivity and phenomenal character are two independent components of consciousness. Instead, the relationship is more like the relationship between hue and color. One is a way of varying with respect to the other. Another way of illustrating this point about how subjectivity and phenomenal character relate is that you can think of the space of subjectivity values as a partition of the space of phenomenal character values. So by value, I mean a maximally determinate way of having a property. So here, for example, is a toy model. Let's imagine that in this big grid, each cell is a distinct value of phenomenal character. It's a maximally determinate total way of being such that there's something it's like to be an entity. And to say that subjectivity is a partition of phenomenal character is to say that we can divide these cells into equivalence classes, where each equivalence class corresponds to a value of subjectivity. For example, we might think of subjectivity as corresponding to the columns of this table. Okay, so far, everything that I've said just basically follows from the definitions of subjectivity and phenomenal character. And so far, I've been focused on characterizing their structural relationship to each other. Let me say a little bit also about the structure of subjectivity itself. Now, it's an open question how subjectivity is structured. And that's because how we think about subjectivity ultimately is going to depend on which theory of consciousness is correct. And we don't know which theory of consciousness is correct yet. Every theory has a different answer as to what makes an entity feel some way at all. And that is just the definition of subjectivity. But we can think about what the structure of subjectivity is if we conditionalize on various theories. If we suppose this theory is true, then what follows about the structure of subjectivity? So let me mention three kinds of views to just showcase a range of possibilities for what the structure of subjectivity might be. So as a first example, suppose that you're, say, a predictive processing theorist. And suppose you think that what it is to be conscious is to have an internal model of the world. And suppose that while two entities can differ in the contents of their internal models, they can't differ in the having of the model itself. Well, that would give us a picture where the inner light is just either on or off. There aren't any other settings for the light. Now, of course, the room that's illuminated can differ. The contents of the internal model can differ. But the light itself has only one value. And that gives us a picture where subjectivity itself is zero-dimensional. The space of values associated with subjectivity is just a single point. So there aren't ways of varying with respect to subjectivity. But as another example, think about IIT. So according to IIT, to be conscious is to have a maximal phi value. And famously, maximal phi values can be higher or lower. And when it's higher, the system is more conscious, according to IIT. So this would give us a picture where the inner light, where subjectivity has a dimmer for brightness. Maybe it shines more brightly in some creatures than others. Maybe there's more light in you than in me. And it gives us a picture where subjectivity is one dimensional. And then finally, as one more example, think about a version of higher order theory where two entities can differ both with respect to the number of higher order thoughts and the strength of those higher order thoughts. So that would give us a picture where the light has multiple settings, maybe it can vary in brightness and color and so forth, and where the dimensionality of subjectivity, where subjectivity is multidimensional. So these are just some examples to showcase how to think about the structure of subjectivity, conditional on various theories of consciousness. But I think this metaphor of the light in the room, it's also useful for thinking about the range of possibilities for the full range of possibilities for what the structure of subjectivity might be. So, for example, I'll just briefly go through some options about the structure of subjectivity expressed in terms of the metaphor. I've already mentioned a picture where the light is simply either on or off, in which case the dimensionality is zero, and consciousness where subjectivity is not degreed, and a picture where the light has a dimmer, where the dimensionality is one, and where subjectivity is degreed. But we could also imagine a picture where maybe the light just varies in hue, but not in brightness. So there's one way of varying with respect to subjectivity, but there can't be more or less subjectivity because there can't be more or less light. Or we can also imagine a picture where the light varies in, say, both aperture and intensity, in which case subjectivity is multidimensional and degreed, or a picture where the light varies in, say, hue and texture, in which case it's multidimensional and not degreed. So this slide is expressing these different views in terms of the metaphor. But I think all of these views, all of these ways of filling out the metaphor actually correspond to live theoretical possibilities about the structure of consciousness. Each option, I think, will correspond to various classes of theories of consciousness. Now, I'm not taking a stance here on which of these options is correct. Instead, I'm just illustrating the fact that there are open questions about the structure of subjectivity. And I think these points are important in part because, for example, some philosophers have argued that consciousness does not come in degrees because consciousness is multidimensional. But once we distinguish subjectivity from phenomenal character, and once we see this full range of options, we can see that multidimensionality is just compatible with degrees. Maybe the light can vary in multiple ways, but it can still be brighter or more dim. Okay, so the most important point for characterizing the structure of subjectivity, though, is again that subjectivity is a dimension of phenomenal character. And in saying this, one question that this raises is you might wonder, well, what are the other dimensions of phenomenal character if subjectivity is not the only one? And I'm not really going to talk about that in this talk, but I'll briefly mention how I'm thinking about it. So I think that in addition to subjectivity, if we're trying to break down phenomenal character, then we should also postulate a category of qualitative character, which metaphorically we can think of as corresponding to the qualities of the objects in the room, and locative character, which metaphorically we can think of as corresponding to the locations that those objects occupy, and objectual character, which we can think of as the objects themselves or the binding together of different features. So I think these are all fundamentally different aspects of phenomenal character. And I think actually not just in a metaphorical sense. I think each of these aspects can be motivated by either general metaphysical or scientific considerations, and each has a corresponding interpretation within the metaphor. So one of my big projects right now, actually, which I hope will eventually comprise one half of a book on the structure of consciousness, is developing and motivating this whole picture on the slide. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm just concerned with subjectivity and phenomenal character. And that's in part because I think it's just these two notions that are precipitations of the meaning of phenomenal consciousness. So remember, there's three claims I want to make in this talk. And the first claim is about ambiguity. The term phenomenal consciousness is systematically ambiguous between expressing subjectivity versus phenomenal character. We can ask, is consciousness the light or the room? And now I've also talked about structure. what are the parameters of light. So in the remaining time that I have, I'll just mention a few applications of this distinction to theoretical issues about consciousness. Now, I think this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character elucidates a lot of questions about consciousness. And I'm not going to talk about all of these, but in short, just to list them, I think that once we see this distinction clearly, we'll better understand questions about the explanatory targets of theories of consciousness, degrees of consciousness, dimensions of consciousness, global states of consciousness, the notion of empty consciousness, the relationship between cognitive science and the science of consciousness, and some other issues too. But for purposes of time, I'm just going to select a couple of these applications. So I'm going to talk about the explanatory targets and empty consciousness, and actually also dimensions of consciousness. That should be highlighted too. And I'm not going to talk about these in much detail because I only have 5 minutes left. My aim is to just briefly dip into each of these issues to give you a feel for how the subjectivity phenomenal character distinction interacts with these other questions. So let's start with an easy one. What is the explanatory target for a theory of consciousness? Well, obviously the answer is consciousness, but if I'm right that the term consciousness is ambiguous between subjectivity and phenomenal character, then we should expect that different theories of consciousness will be targeting different explananda. And I think you see this in both the science and the philosophy of consciousness. So, for example, think again about global workspace theory. Global workspace theory is primarily a theory of the light. It's a theory that tells us what divides the class of conscious entities from the class of non-conscious entities. And the answer is having a global workspace. But global workspace theory by itself, it doesn't actually tell us or give us the theory of what it's like to be an entity. You have to pair global workspace theory with another theory that gives you an account of what kinds of things can be inside the global workspace. Now, on the other hand, let's think about intentionalism or representationalism about consciousness. So intentionalism, or at least one version of it, says that to be conscious is to experientially represent certain contents. And that gives us a nice theory of what it's like to be a subject. It tells us that what it's like to be you is a matter of what you're representing, how you're representing the world. But it doesn't really tell us about what makes an entity feel some way at all. It doesn't tell us about what it is to bear that experiential representational attitude in the first place. And in fact, one way to see this is to note that you could actually combine global workspace theory and representationalism or intentionalism. And in fact, oftentimes that's implicitly assumed. Oftentimes people thinking about global workspace theory will assume that it's the representations or the contents in the global workspace theory in the global workspace that determine what it's like to be an entity. So that would be to combine a theory of the light with a theory of the room. Now, there are some theories that do aim to do both. For example, I think integrated information theory is trying to give an account of both features. According to IIT, what it is for an entity to feel some way at all is to have a maximal phi value. And what it's like to be an entity is a matter of their Q structures or maximally irreducible conceptual structures. So there are other examples too, but I won't go further on this point. This is just intended to illustrate that different theories in the consciousness literature sometimes aim at different explanatory targets. And I think this is important because sometimes I think people are talking past each other when they disagree about theories of consciousness or disagree about whether a theory is a theory of consciousness at all. And once we have this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character in place, then I think we can better see how different people and different theories are sometimes targeting different explananda. Okay, I'll just briefly go through 2 more applications and wrap up. So here's a second application. Question, is consciousness multidimensional? Now, I mentioned earlier that a dimension informally is a way of varying with respect to some kind. But one thing you might think is, well, this question is kind of puzzling because aren't there innumerable ways of varying with respect to consciousness? I mean, just think about all the different ways in which what it's like to be you might be different from what it's like to be me. But on the other hand, it also seems like not all ways of varying with respect to consciousness are equally important. It seems like there are some ways of varying with respect to consciousness that are more privileged or special or metaphysically more significant, and that have a stronger claim to being called dimensions of consciousness. And also, sometimes people contrast unidimensional models of consciousness with multidimensional models of consciousness. And you might wonder what exactly is going on there, given how many ways of varying there are with respect to what it's like. So here's my diagnosis of what's going on. I think this question, is consciousness multidimensional, can actually be interpreted in two different ways. It can be a question about subjectivity or a question about phenomenal character. And if we're thinking about subjectivity, then it's an open question whether consciousness is multidimensional. It's an open question whether the light varies in multiple ways, whether it has multiple parameters. And that's a very interesting and substantive question. But if we're thinking of consciousness as phenomenal character, as the room, then it's just obvious that consciousness is multidimensional. There's no way of disputing that because there's just innumerable ways in which what it's like to be you can vary from what it's like to be me. So I think once we have this distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character in place, we can better understand what this question is supposed to be and the sense in which this question is substantive and interesting. Okay, so very briefly, just one more very speculative final application, which I added mostly just because of the themes of this conference. Another question that you sometimes hear people ask is, what is empty consciousness? And my answer is, who knows? I don't know. But what I have in mind here is something that's discussed most often in the context of either mystical experiences or meditative experiences. And people use other nearby terms like minimal consciousness or empty mind, an experience with no content, or sometimes pure subjectivity. And that is an expression that I found quite opaque for a long time. But when I thought about that expression in the context of what I'm presenting here, I started to wonder whether this framework that I'm expressing might give us a way of making sense of this idea. So I think one way of interpreting what empty consciousness means is that it's an illuminated room with nothing in it. Or putting it another way, it's just pure light with nothing that is being illuminated. So more theoretically, this would be a conscious experience that instantiates a value with respect to subjectivity, but no other values with respect to the other aspects of phenomenal character. So this would be like an empty global workspace or a higher order thought with no content or experientially representing nothing or being perceptually acquainted with nothing. So this is a very speculative idea. I don't know if this is possible, but I think that this might be one way of making sense of what people who have talked about empty consciousness might have in mind. And I think it's just an interesting theoretical question whether there could be a conscious state that satisfies this kind of description, that instantiates subjectivity, but not any other aspects of phenomenal character. So just to wrap up, to summarize, what I've done is I've argued for three claims. I've distinguished subjectivity from the phenomenal character. And I think the most important of these is the ambiguity point. I think the term phenomenal consciousness is systematically ambiguous between these two meanings. And we can ask whether in any given context, by consciousness, somebody has in mind the light or the room. And I've also tried to showcase how there are open questions about the structure of subjectivity, which metaphorically you can think of as questions about the structure, the parameters of the light. And I've also selected a few possible applications of this distinction, in particular to explanatory targets of consciousness, of theories of consciousness, to whether consciousness is multidimensional, and to the notion of empty consciousness. So I'll end by just mentioning again that this talk covers a lot of recent research that I've been focused on. This distinction between subjectivity and phenomenal character, it arises across I think 5 papers I'm working on at the moment. And as I mentioned, I hope for this distinction to be a centerpiece for a future book on the structure of consciousness. And if you're interested in reading something of mine on these ideas, I'd recommend a forthcoming piece called The Light in the Room. You can scan the QR code to get access. This is going to be the opening chapter for a new philosophy of mind course book. And it's intended to be introductory, but I think the content will be of interest to professional consciousness researchers as well. And it discusses this metaphor of the light in the room in a very accessible way. You can access it here or through my website online. Okay, thank you all for listening.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.